Eye of the Beholder by Ruth Nordin, Chapter 2. Omaha, Nebraska, June 1874. Dave Larson pulled the brake on his wagon and tied the two geldings' reins to his seat. He hopped down to the ground, his brown boots hitting the dirt road that served as one of the main streets in Omaha. Taking off his hat, he used his sleeve to wipe the sweat from his forehead. He ruffled his dark blonde hair and set the hat back on his head. The sun beat down on him, causing his gray eyes to squint. His light blue shirt and brown pants felt sticky as sweat clung to his body. He debated entering the mercantile, but decided to check the post office first. After verifying nothing important came, he made his way past several people, exchanging the usual pleasantries on the way to the mercantile. He didn't care to waste time dealing with anything but purchasing the food that would give him something doable to eat for the next month. Though he didn't live far from town, he preferred to keep his visits to at least once a month. He had a farm to manage and didn't like missing work. He stepped into the mercantile and nodded at Ralph Linden, who owned the place. "Good to see you, Larson," the 50-year-old thin man with a head full of shaggy white hair and glasses smiled. "What brings you into town today?" "I have a minor emergency," Dave said. "I ran out of food." "Again?" Dave grinned ruefully. "I know. When will I ever get organized?" "Should I gather usual items for you?" Ralph asked. "No, I'll just run through the store and throw whatever I want into the basket." Ralph chuckled. "You're a hopeless cause, Larson." Dave shrugged and began his haphazard quest for food. Neil Craftsman entered the store. "I have to buy a ring for my bride." Dave dumbly stared at his neighbor, who nodded a quick greeting in his direction as he strode over to the counter, next to the cash register where Ralph stood. "Is she the woman who answered your ad?" Ralph asked. "Yes, she comes from Maine," Neil replied. Dave still couldn't believe it. Neil posted an ad for a wife? Dave didn't realize he wanted to settle down, since most of the town knew he was busy trying to sow his wild oats. Dave shook his head. Perhaps the man realized that running around a whorehouse wasn't the most productive use of his time. It made sense that he had to send away for a wife, since no self-respecting woman would marry him if she knew his past. "So, you're going to settle down and be a family man?" Ralph inquired as he accepted the money for the ring, looking as shocked as Dave felt. "There comes a time in a man's life when he has to take responsibility for his future," Neil replied. "I'm already 30. "I hope you plan to honor those wedding vows when you make them." Ralph handed Neil the change. "Oh, I intend to. After my pa died, I realized it was time to get serious about having kids. Someone has to take over my farm when I die." Dave watched as the grinning groom exited the store. Glancing at Ralph, he raised an eyebrow. "Do we trust him?" "Stranger things have happened. I'll know soon enough when people bring in their news. Being a store owner, I can't help but hear what goes on in town." "Of course you don't add to the gossip," Dave teased. Ralph's eyes widened. "I might straighten out some wrong thinking. If it's true, then it's news. If it's false, then it's gossip." "Sure," Dave didn't hide his sarcasm. "I don't think I'm any more of a lost cause than you are." Chuckling under his breath, he turned back to the items on the shelves. To his dismay, he realized that he had selected the same items he usually bought, and he wasn't the only one who noticed it. "Looks like you got the usual," Ralph stated when Dave brought the basket to the counter. Two other customers entered the store, preventing Dave from defending himself. After all, a single man could only manage so many recipes. Since Ralph quickly rung up his order so he could assist the old women with his sewing supplies, Dave was spared the older man's ribbing. Exiting the place, he carried the two boxes full of food and settled them into the back of his wagon. With any luck, it would get him through a month, though it was due to be bland. A wife who knew how to cook would be a blessing, he thought as he recalled his mother's tasty pot roasts with fresh vegetables and fruit salad. His stomach growled at the memory. He had lost 10 pounds in the 7 months he spent by himself on the farm. He occasionally made it to his parents' place to eat a good meal, but not as often as he wished. Though Neil was the last person Dave looked to for advice on anything to do to improve his life, he had to admit that a wife was probably the smartest thing a man could do for himself. He did need another set of hands at the farm, so someone could share the burden with him. Not that he considered farming to be a burden, but it would be easier to get the chores done if he had a wife. He knew his next trip to Omaha would involve posting an ad in the papers back east, asking for one. Plenty of men did it. He supposed he should too, especially since he didn't know any available women who were old enough to get married. As he got ready to jump into his wagon, he looked toward the station of the Union Pacific Railroad. The train was sitting on the tracks, waiting for people to either hop on or get off. He wondered briefly which of the few women disembarking would be Neil's intended from Maine. He hesitated, wondering if he should satisfy his curiosity and see what type of woman answered an ad in a newspaper. Would it give him an idea of what to expect when one responded to his ad? Drumming his fingers on the side of the wagon, he happened to spot Neil, who left the saloon, quickly tucking in his shirt. He felt a rush of sorrow for the person Neil went to meet. For all this talk about a wife and settling down, Neil didn't seem willing to give up the pleasures of the flesh. Disgusted, Dave decided that he should warn her about the man she would be marrying. He couldn't stand idly by and watch another man mistreat a woman the way Clyde had mistreated his sister. Dave crossed the boardwalk and entered the train station. People milled about, stretching their legs and asking directions to the nearest restaurant. He bypassed an old woman and a plump brunette with child in tow, as well as a pretty woman in a striking yellow dress. None were Neil's type. For a moment, he thought the pretty blonde searching the crowd would be Neil's woman. But an elderly gentleman snatched her away. He inched his way through the crowd. He was tall enough to look over the heads of most of the men and women, but still short enough not to call too much attention to himself. He finally spotted Neil and a woman in a hunter green dress over by the newspaper stand in the corner of the room. Dave's eyes rested upon her plain appearance. He knew she didn't match up to Neil's standards, though she did have an ample bosom and nice hips. The man running the newspaper stand looked uncomfortable, standing as far away from the couple as he could. Trying to be unobtrusive, Dave wove through the crowd, determined to rescue her. When he realized that Neil wasn't happy, he halted by a stack of newspapers to his right. The man at the stand seemed relieved to have someone nearby. Glancing at the man, he saw the man shake his head. "There's a fight brewing," he whispered to Dave. "I'd stay out of it if I were you." Interested, Dave turned his attention back to the unlikely couple. "Miss Peters," Neil began, a smile plastered on his face, "you are not what I expected." The woman paused for a moment, as if considering her words with great care. "Your ad asks for a hard-working and dependable woman who can provide you with children. I assure you that I'm not afraid of work, and I will prove myself loyal. As for children, my father has borne my father 12 of them, myself included. I am able to do what you ask. I have in no way misled you. When I wrote the ad, I did not expect. I don't doubt that you can work hard and provide me with many children, but..." Dave knew Neil well enough to realize the man was flabbergasted. His hands waved about him, and his mouth moved, but no sound came out. The woman looked no more pleased than Neil, although she remained composed. There was a certain dignity in the straightness of her back and the tilt of her head. She had inner strength that saw her through the toughest of circumstances. The thought impressed Dave. "But..." She waited for Neil to finish his sentence. When he didn't speak, she said, "But you had a different kind of woman in mind." Neil blinked and shook his head. "I couldn't get drunk enough to get you a child." Dave winced at the cruelty of the remark. Even if Miss Peters was the ugliest woman alive, no one deserved that. He expected the woman to burst into tears, but she did not. She stood before Neil and in a very calm voice said, "Then I surmise that this arrangement won't work." "You're right it won't," Neil snapped. Dave knew it irked the man to no end that she declared it before he did. "Very well," she said. "I won't trouble you any further, and you may have your money back." She handed him the bills that had been neatly folded in her purse. "I don't wish to have anything from you. The trip here is enough. Thank you, Mr. Craftsman." Neil grabbed the money with a huff and stumped away, cussing under his breath about women. Next time I'll request a pretty wife, he grumbled as he passed Dave, not seeming to notice him. Neil plopped his hat onto his head and stormed out of the building. Dave found this particular woman to be intriguing. She maintained a quiet dignity in the midst of adversity. Such a woman should not be overlooked. He stepped around the stand and got his first good look at her. She didn't possess the classic beauty most men sought, but she wasn't ugly like Neil claimed. She sat on the bench, hands folded in her lap, head slightly bowed. She looked as if she had waited for someone to pick her up, instead of enduring a torrid rejection. The only indication that Neil had disturbed her was the fingernails digging into the palms of her hands. He detected freckles on the bridge of her big nose and her rosy cheeks, which he found charming. As he neared, she glanced up at him, her aqua-colored eyes wet with unshed tears. She blinked a few times, clearing them. He liked her eyes. They were a lovely color. Her fingers relaxed, her palms marked with tiny red crescents. "Am I in your way?" He smiled and shook his head. "No, ma'am. Considering the fact that you're sitting on a bench that's stuck in a corner, you aren't in anyone's way." She looked surprised, and he wondered if she had ever received a kind word from the world of men. He suspected she was 18, or maybe a little older, and upon further inspection, he noted a sweet look about her. "Oh, then you wish to sit?" She quickly stood up and moved away from the bench. "I can find somewhere else to go. I should get a newspaper anyway." "I can buy you one and bring it here," he offered. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Why not? You're a stranger in this community, and it would only be fitting if someone welcomed you to town. I noticed that Neil Craftsman did a lousy job of it." She sighed and smoothed her hands on her dark green dress, which matched her bonnet. "Oh, you overheard?" Her cheeks grew red as she stared at the beige travel bag by her feet. "I overheard Neil giving up a decent woman. You know, I couldn't help but be impressed with how well you handled yourself." She shrugged. "I figured, in the long run, he did me a favor." "He did you a bigger favor than you realize," Dave said. "I guarantee you're much better off without him." Now that marrying the man wouldn't happen, he no longer felt the need to warn her about his loose morals. Shifting from one foot to the other, she returned his gaze and said, "I should get a paper." "May I buy it for you?" he offered. She hesitated for a moment before digging a coin out of her purse. This should cover the cost. She was generous. He held up his hand in protest. "That's not necessary. After what you went through, it would be my pleasure to show you that one person in Omaha knows how to welcome a lady. I'll be faster than you can say Dave Larson." Her eyebrows furrowed, but he left before she could say anything. He nodded a greeting to several people who strolled through the station, until he reached the man selling newspapers at the stand. "Felt sorry for her too?" the man asked as he took the coin. Dave raised an eyebrow. "I was thinking more along the lines of respect and admiration. It's not every woman who can hold her own against the likes of Neil Craftsman." Once he purchased a copy, he returned to her and handed it to her, surprised that she was still standing. "Thank you, sir." She accepted the paper. "I should allow you the space on the bench." "Please stay," Dave said. "I wish to speak to you, and it'd be easier to do that if I'm sitting next to you, instead of yelling at you from across the room." A small smile turned the corners of her lips up. "I can't argue with that logic." So she had a sense of humor. That was nice to know. She sat down, and he sat beside her, careful to keep a respectful distance between them in case people talked. "What is it you wish to discuss, Mr. "My name is Dave Larson." "Oh, I'm afraid I missed that when you told me the first time. I must be having one of those days." In more way than one, he thought, as he recalled her conversation with Neil. When he realized that she was waiting for him to continue, he cleared his throat. "I'm not graceful at this sort of thing, Miss—" Her eyes grew wide. "I'm sorry, Mr. Larson. My name is Mary Peters." "Miss Peters, the truth of the matter is that while I overheard you and Neil talking, it occurred to me that you're the kind of woman who would make a man a good wife. Now, I know it's strange that we just met this way, and you're likely to think I'm crazy, but you're the kind of woman I've been looking for. You're kind, strong, and generous. You told Neil that you're hardworking and dependable. I'm sure you have other admirable qualities as well. She stared at him, as if not believing her ears. Finally, she shook her head. Surely there are other women in town that are more to her liking. You'd be wrong to assume that. The women I know who are of childbearing age are already taken, too young, or a relative. I need a wife. It can be tough to keep up with the farm without help. In fact, I was trying to come up with an ad asking for one. She glanced at the paper resting in her lap. I don't know, Mr. Larson. I really am not what you are looking for. He realized he needed to find another way to convince her to marry him. I'm forced to write an ad, since you said no. Would you help me figure out what to say? I want to make sure I have the right woman. There's no sense in sending her here if she can't handle what I need on the farm. All right, I can do that. He searched his pockets. His cheeks grew warm. I didn't bring anything to write with, or to write on. She picked up the paper and sorted through it. Finding a blank space on the paper, she tore it and handed it to him. I do have a pencil you can use. She opened her purse and took it out. Giving it to him, she waited for him to begin. He grinned at her. You're the kind of person who takes the shirt off her back for a fellow in need. She blushed. I beg your pardon, ma'am. I didn't mean that the way it sounded. I was quoting an expression my father uses. It means that you help others without a thought to yourself. Wishing to ease her embarrassment, he motioned to the paper in his hand. What words do you figure will best attract a woman who won't shy away from life on a farm? Well, I've never lived on a farm. What would she have to do? Obviously, I need someone to help keep my house. I don't have much time to clean, do laundry, or cook. As it is, I don't eat much besides jerky. She frowned. A man needs a better diet than that. Exactly, he said. I may be 22, but I burn everything I attempt to make. It's rather sad. Do I write that I want someone who could cook and clean? She nodded. If you work outside all day, you'll need your energy, and you'll need a variety of foods to do that. I do need help with a few animals I have. Sometimes I don't get around to milking my cow until midday, and again past sundown. Can you imagine how uncomfortable the poor animal is during the day? It'd be a big help if she would do that for me. I don't mind showing her how to do it. I just hope she's willing to learn. What type of farm do you own? She asked. I grow corn and beans. Besides a cow, I have a stallion, 2 geldings, and a mare. The mare is due to foal in a week or 2. I would like help in the delivery in case something goes wrong. Most of the time, mares deliver without assistance, but you never know until the birth is done. Do you think a woman would be willing to do that? She shrugged. I don't see why not. Women throughout history have helped deliver human babies into the world. I don't think an animal would be much different. He appreciated her agreeability to learn new skills, even when it was clear that she had no farming experience. Where are you from? From a small town in Maine, she said. My father owned the grocery store, and my brothers helped him with it. My sisters married as soon as they turned 16 or 17. I worked at a restaurant. How old are you? 19, she said. As he took another moment to examine her, he noted that her eyes had the most amazing color. At times they looked green, but at the moment he swore they were blue. She certainly had a lovely smile and straight white teeth. Her hair was braided under her bonnet, but several strands broke free, which he found charming. Her frame was certainly pleasing to behold. She had curves everywhere a woman should have them. He couldn't understand why someone else hadn't married her yet, but their loss was his gain, if he could get her to go with him to the judge. You'd really help me out if you saved me the time of placing this ad and marry me, he said. You may want someone who's more acceptable to look at, she replied. There's nothing wrong with the way you look. She seemed stunned by his announcement. Well, I'm not thin. Considering the intensity of the Nebraska winds on some days, a thin woman could easily get blown away. At least I won't have to run after you to keep you safely on the property. She laughed. He chuckled. She had a nice laugh. I like to get back to my farm and make sure everything is fine out there. If you're willing to be my wife, I'd like to marry you right away. Is there no one else to help you? Nope, I'm all by myself. She glanced at the travel bag sitting at her feet. You're serious, aren't you? Of course. However, if you'd rather return to Maine, I'll post the ad and hope you'll answer it. Then you can come right back here. I prefer to skip that and just marry you now, though. She nodded. All right. I'll help you in any way I can on the farm. She definitely impressed him. He stood up and took her luggage. The courthouse is on the way home. I know Judge Johnson. He's my brother-in-law, so he'll see us right away. He led her to the wagon and placed her bag in it. He looked over at her and found her missing. A quick scan of the area notified him that she had picked up a bonnet that had blown off a little girl's head. He shook his head. What was Neil thinking when he let her go? He stepped to the side of the wagon. If you're still willing to marry me, we can do it over there. He pointed to the courthouse down the street. She looked startled by his words. I'll take the fact that you weren't protesting as a yes. May I walk you to the building? He held his arm out to her. After a moment, she nodded and gave a slight grin. I can't get married alone. Neither can I. It's a good thing we're together. His smile widened as she put her arm around his and walked with him on the boardwalk. How long did it take for you to get here? He asked. Nearly a week, she said. What do you think of Omaha so far? It's big, and there are a lot of people. Overwhelming? A little. The town I came from was smaller. Well, he began, it'll be just us at the farm, so you might miss the crowd. Of course, I have a handful of relatives you'll get along great with, so you won't be confined to my presence all the time. It hardly seems like being alone with you will be a bad thing, she said. You strike me as an honest and good man. She looked away from him as she said it. I reckon that we'll get along just fine, he replied. They reached the front entrance of the courthouse, so he opened the door for her. She thanked him and went into the building. The thought flashed through his mind that her hips would serve nicely to put his hands on during lovemaking. He hadn't considered that part of the equation until that moment, and he found that he couldn't wait to enjoy this aspect of marriage. And that is the end of Chapter 2.